And every time I see you, I always think of like Austin Powers with your white chair. And I always feel like you have like a button or something, and then like your walls open up and there's like a shark tank behind you with like
Oh
lasers.
man.
The information in the podcast is not intended or implied to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please talk to a medical professional before doing anything that may impact your health. Hello, welcome to my podcast, Two Mics, One Joey Suit. I am Joey Suit. I'll be giving my mic to Abbey Hauser. She is a 20-year-old person who was diagnosed with the classic Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome. Ehlers-Danlos is having over-flexible joints and stretchy, flexible skin. So happy to have you. How are you?
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I'm pretty good. Yeah, can't complain right now.
So Abby has a blog website called Owning the Story that is also her Instagram handle. I recommend following her and reading her blog. I have a whole lot of questions to ask. Ready?
I'm ready.
I know it's super personal, but what's your favorite sandwich?
Favorite sandwich? Peanut butter and jelly.
We're going with the classic peanut butter and jelly?
The classic. You know, I don't think I've evolved much since childhood, so we're sticking with the classic.
Oh, I never got to that level. I can't do it. I'm not a peanut butter person.
Oh, well, that'll do it.
Yeah. I do love jelly though.
Yeah, that is. I was more just a peanut butter person growing up, and in
Oof.
adulthood became a peanut butter and jelly person.
That might be hard to eat though.
Yeah, it's not. I don't know. I don't know what I liked about it as a kid, but it was very chewy.
Okay, great. Now we're both hungry. And anybody watching this episode. Anyway, let's talk about October 7th, 2018. I know it was a huge day for you.
Yes, it was. That was the day that I ran and finished the Chicago Marathon. Yeah, the year before I had run it and had to drop out at mile 22 because it was a hot mess of things that went wrong that day. Nothing that I think I did would have made me get to that finish line because it was still it was like 7.5 hours to get to mile 22. But then the next year I knew that I felt comfortable enough trying it again. Obviously, at least for me, running was never like super recommended with my rare disease, but it's something that I did growing up and that I felt like I knew my body enough to know when I like shouldn't do something. Like I felt like I would know in my heart when it was too hard or too painful. So I tried it again that day and I had a lot of support. I started using my forearm crutches to run with a couple of years prior to that marathon. So I ran with them the whole time, but I had friends on the team. I ran for a charity team. So I had like coaches and like a team manager that were out on the course as well. It was just like a very fully supported course usage, and we used a lot of accommodations with their athletes with disabilities group. So I think that day everything magically went right, and it took those same almost 7.5 hours to run the full 26.2. And that was more just something that I thought I could always do, and I figured that was the time to do it. And it happened. I didn't actually know if it would, to be honest, after that first failure. I think you're always wondering if it's going to stay possible because you're like, well, maybe that one was my max. But you really don't know until you try it again. So I'm just really lucky it worked out. I don't see another one in that same format in my future, but I wouldn't say no to an alternative method of the marathon.
So let's talk about before the marathon. Like, how did you train? Because I know Ehlers-Danlos that you have over flexible joints and such, but then isn't like the marathon like the last thing you want to do?
Yeah, so for me, the marathon training the second time around, the first time I tried to follow like a more standard plan, And that clearly was not meant for my body because just the training load itself was getting to be too much. And I think that's part of why the first time it didn't go well, because my body just wasn't made to run that long distance multiple times. Like in marathon training, you tend to run as you get longer. It's like you'll run multiple runs over 10 miles, like 1 week, and then the next week you're doing 12 and then 10 and things like that. Whereas before, 10 was like out of sight, like didn't even think I was going to be able to hit that amount. So the fact that I got to that point in my first set of training was good, but then come time to the marathon, and I definitely felt like my body was just like done before I even started. So the second time I took a very unconventional approach, I would say, and I really only did my long run on the weekends, and that was on, I'm pretty sure this is correct, but I'm pretty sure that was like the only running that I did. I would do like cross training where I would like bike or just do like strength training or even just like rest days, because with my joints, overtaxing them is like the worst thing that you can do because you're always kind of on this precipice of injury. So it's kind of finding that balance of training my body a little bit, but also not training it so much that I get injured. So I really just did like a run on a weekend and would kind of build it up from there. I don't think my longest run was longer than 10 miles for that marathon. And I just saved that effort for the actual day of. And I don't recommend that plan to any like actual serious runners, but it worked well for me. So.
Oh my God, that's a huge, that's almost, that's 2.5 more.
Yeah.
Especially what you have too, that's even more impressive.
I mean, it worked for me. I think I was just really in tune that second time to listen to my body and know that I didn't have to follow like a set training plan, because I knew that the set training plan completely failed me the first time because it just wasn't meant for my body. And I didn't know that at the time. Like, how was I supposed to know when the longest run I'd done up to that point was, I think I'd done a few half marathons, but like that one, you only run that distance at the race day anyway. So I really wasn't used to running.
So was it more of just like mind over matter? Like you're going to do the 26.2 miles no matter what?
Yeah, I think at that point it became a lot of mental fortitude, but also just like playing it smart too, because especially with me, with my type of Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, I ended up having some like bone involvement. So we didn't know this at the time, but I had lower bone density that we just didn't know to test for in childhood. So we didn't know it until I started having a bunch of stress fractures in my spine.
Wait, so what does lower bone density mean?
It means it's like the thicker and more dense your bones are, the like more robust and like strong they are. So a lower bone density, it makes it easier to fracture a bone.
So that's not good for you.
No. So like the lowest type of bone density is osteoporosis. And there's like a spectrum from like regular bone health to like super fragile bones that you associate with like older people. So I was kind of somewhere in the middle, but we didn't know that until like I randomly showed up with these stress fractures that show up in the spine from people that like do gymnastics and like other things that are hard on their spine. And I didn't do any of those things. So that is really what like set running to start to be more difficult, because running is just a lot of pounding repeatedly. So for me, luckily my joints held up other places, but my spine was definitely the biggest issue. And I really had to like stay on top of both like pain, because I take pain medications throughout the day. So then we had to create like a whole schedule for during the race of when you take those, because it's 7.5 hours is covered like 2 different times that I would normally take meds anyway. So it's like you have to remember that for that long of a time, it's like you have to plan all these things out with people or with someone that's carrying them, or just not to forget, because if I was in charge of it completely by myself, I would have forgotten for sure. So
yeah, so you have another blog post, and you put your disease as walking on glass. And so I'm kind of curious, like, what? So, like, it says your joint can go out of place. So that I mean, like, so let's say one day you can walk and then, or let's say during the marathon you could walk and then all of a sudden you'll just, I guess, fall down and just not walk anymore? Or, like, how does that work?
So for me, for that one, that was a really great metaphor that I came across that I kind of expanded on. But with EDS, you can have joint dislocations, which is just like where a joint goes out of place. So, like, if you think of like your kneecap, like shifting to the side or out of its natural groove that it exists in.
Yeah, it's a horrible image.
Yeah. So that's how I was diagnosed, was after a bunch of knee dislocations as a kid. But like you can do it to your shoulder. It happens to a lot more of like the
But do you
ball
know
and
why?
socket joints.
Do you know why you get it versus like a regular person that doesn't get it at all? Like, what makes you more prone to getting them?
For us with EDS, especially for my subtype, we know the gene, but we know that all the subtypes, there's an issue with collagen, which is a protein in your body that I always liken to, like, it's like the glue of your body. So there's a bunch of different types of collagen in your body, and they do a bunch of different things. So different diseases that affect different types of collagen result in different manifestations. Because you have collagen in your bones, you have collagen like in your skin, it's in like your ligaments, around all your organs. It's different types. But for especially my type, there's type 5 collagen, which affects different, more like the ligaments and those types of things in your joints. And then some bone involvement as well. But it's more like it's a perfect storm of there's just not a lot holding the joint in place. Like naturally, normally your ligaments would hold it in and your tendons and muscles would work together to hold a joint in. But when you sort of lose some of that glue, then all of a sudden your muscles have to take over that work on their own if they can. But if they're not strong enough, then that joint is just going to keep moving in and out a lot easier than someone that has like that strong ligament base would do.
So does it get worse for you as you get older? Since like older people are more prone to get injuries?
Yeah, so the genetic defect itself like isn't progressive. Like it's not like the collagen itself gets worse over time. But I always liken it to like the damage that collagen causes gets worse over time. So like if you just imagine like repetitive injuries over time are going to cause issues for your body, no matter what is causing the injury, whether you're healthy or not. So it's more like the more often that you have these injuries and issues that you're more prone to like early onset, like arthritis.
So you're like an athlete like that just retired right now.
Yeah, that's what it feels like. Yeah, it's like your body is prone to so many injuries, but it just sort of like builds up over time.
So let's say you get a dislocated shoulder, you just pop it back in yourself?
It depends on the type of dislocation. I think most people with EDS have put quite a few joints back in their self. Sometimes not even on purpose. Like it's just like your body's instinct is to like grab whatever hurts, and sometimes that alone like puts it back in place. I know when I was a kid, I went to the ER quite a few times to get my knee put back in place. And then one time it went back in on its own on accident. I was just holding it in like a panic, and somehow me holding it and then something I did to move my leg like slid it back in place. But most of the time, I think if it's a full dislocation, you might end up at an ER. But if it's a partial, which just means it like slightly goes out of place, but you can quickly put it back in, you can kind of take care of that on your own. But generally, it's recommended that if you have some sort of dislocation recurring, that you at least get like an x-ray to make sure that everything's like back in place if it feels like a bigger one.
So if anyone ever breaks or dislocates them, please call Abby immediately.
I've got you. I know all the tips and tricks.
So is it like now like a normal injury? Like you, let's say, pop out your shoulder and then pop it back in? are you like in a arm cast or anything like that, or like can you go back to normal, or like how does it?
I think for most, or at least for me, like unless it's like a really bad dislocation that causes like pain later on, like more severe pain after, like days after the fact, I don't need to do anything special, aside from just like icing and taking care of the joint itself. But there have been a few where I've like put it back in and it felt fine at the time, but then like 3 days later, the pain like keeps getting worse. And then that's when you'd go for like more standard dislocation treatment. Cause like most people that would dislocate, like say a knee, would go to the ER, get it put back in, and you'd be put in like an immobilizer cast, basically like a soft Velcro thing that keeps your knee straight. And you'd be in a knee brace and you'd have like this whole course of treatment. But when it happens so many times, one good part about EDS is that sometimes you can put it back in and there's just less damage to the joint than would happen to somebody that it happened like forcefully. Like if it happened during like a soccer injury, I don't know how other people dislocate their knees, but I imagine usually it's like a traumatic event, so it usually causes more like structural issues as opposed to like mine would dislocate like rolling over in bed. So like that's a little bit easier to put back in with less.
It's such a lame story if you tell someone like maybe sharing
Yes,
injuries.
I know all my injury stories are so lame. Like I dislocated my shoulder holding the door open for someone.
Oh my
Like
god.
Like who? I can't even make that up. Like that's the lamest story. I just reached back for the door. The door was too heavy and it took my shoulder right with it. But I was like, why did I even reach back for the door? I should have just not held it.
Let's screw the person.
Yeah, so almost all I think every injury story that I have involves like super tame things. Nothing has ever been a cool injury, and I'm still waiting to have like a cool injury story.
So do you like avoid things now? Like since you mentioned that you opened the door and now you're dislocated, do you like just avoid opening all doors at all times now?
I think right away, I honestly like did not want to open any doors with that shoulder just because of like the mental block.
Mm-hmm.
Whether, I mean, that dislocation like went back in place and it was just more irritated for a few days and then it was fine. But like the mental like memories always flood back after like a dislocation or a partial dislocation. So I feel like I end up avoiding things like immediately after. And then eventually, as my brain like forgets about it, then I'll go back to doing whatever it was I was doing. But I definitely stopped opening doors with my right arm for like a solid month after that time. Just because I figured I was like, well, the right one's worse. So I was like, might as well do the left. It's a little bit stronger. And yet it was like way more awkward to open doors with my left hand. Like it looked just like the door would be in a weird spot and I would like awkwardly like twist to open it with my left hand just to avoid my right arm for no
Yeah, like what's
reason.
wrong with this person today?
Other than my brain was like, I don't know, if we do that, something bad might happen, so you might just want to wait.
So you mentioned earlier that since you don't have collagen, lets your muscle work more. So is it worth them being in better shape to help?
Yeah. So with, I mean, the collagen that we have, like we have collagen, but it's faulty. It's just like weaker, I guess, than other collagen. And I've found, and I know that a lot of places recommend it, but the stronger that you can be, um, the better sort of outcomes that you can have just with like pain management and like reducing dislocations. And that said, it's easier to just blanketly say that at a doctor's office than it is to put it into practice, especially if you're someone coming from like a lot of dislocations and pain. Like that movement itself can cause pain. So getting stronger hurts more and it might cause more injuries in the meantime. So it's always this like slowly building effect, and then you get injured and it goes back down. But I've always found that movement helps me stay strong and at least as functional as I am. And I've definitely had doctors say that just since I continued playing the sports I wasn't supposed to play growing up. But then once I hit a certain age, they were like, "Oh, you playing those sports probably like saved your other joints from having issues." So at
So,
the end of the day, I've always found that the stronger you can make your muscles functionally, then at least helps kind of take some of the edge off the faulty collagen. Um, but again, one injury that you have to like completely rest from can undo a ton of work of strength, and then you're back to the drawing board. So it sounds really easy in practice, but it's a lot harder to put.
yeah, it's crazy. Like sometimes you see like bodybuilders and such, and they go to the hospital, and after like a month later, they're like almost normal size again.
You can lose muscle mass really quickly, and especially if you just didn't have a lot to begin with. One injury or one like hospital visit or anything can really set you back, and then it's harder to build it back up for anyone with chronic pain. To movement tends to hurt, so it's finding that balance of movement that doesn't hurt in like a super bad or destructive way.
So it's like hurt more now, so you hurt less later.
Yeah, it's like a fine balance, because if you do something that hurts too much, then you're never going to do the work again or the workout again, or you could end up causing damage that then makes you not have to, that makes you unable to work out. So it's a very fine line, and I love fitness. I'm a certified personal trainer.
That's amazing considering what you have, and like if
Yeah.
I didn't know about the disease without like talking to anyone, I feel like working out would be like the worst thing you can do.
Yeah. And I think that's what they thought back when I was diagnosed. Like I was told, I was diagnosed as a kid in like 2003 or something. And I was told you could swim or play golf. Those were like the two athletic options I could choose from, apparently.
Golf is so lame.
Yeah. And I was like, well, this doesn't even take into account my interests. I was like, this feels wrong. So they're like, or you could get into like theater, or they named like all these other things, and I was like, I'm not like, those are cool, but I'm not interested in them. So I was like, I'm gonna do whatever sports I want without, like, I didn't do impact sports, like what do you call them? What's the name?
Wrestling.
Yeah, contact sports. That's the word. I was thinking of like collision sports, but that's not right.
Yeah, like no football.
Yeah, so I didn't play hockey, didn't play. I played lacrosse, but women's lacrosse is a non-contact sport.
There could be some contact.
There is some contact, but it's not like a check type situation like in hockey or a tackle in football.
I mean, I don't know like where you're from, but I guess you're lucky that you're a woman, because like hockey is not popular with women.
Yeah.
Football is not popular, so you kind of can just eliminate that. Even if you wanted to play, you can't even play it.
Yeah, I mean, where I'm from, hockey's pretty big, and both my brothers played, but I just never had an interest. The skates alone hurt my feet too much to even like consider playing the sport. So that was already off the table. I don't think I ever had a strong interest in it. But I liked endurance sports. I liked sports that I could kind of challenge myself, because I'm not like a talented athlete, but I can work hard. So that's where sports like that came into play, and I think ended up helping in the long run, because otherwise I don't know that I would have been as strong as I was, to even just through like different, like I had a couple knee surgeries and things like that, but I don't know that I would have like bounced back and had like a goal after those if I didn't have like athletic pursuits that I wanted to try to rehab from. If I had nothing to rehab from the surgery from, except for the fact of like someone telling me like you'll feel better when you're older, as a teenager, that's not motivation. So it worked really well, and I've always liked the role.
Well, I don't know if you know, but you know you can buy trophies, and you can pretend you're like the MVP or something.
That's a great idea. I will say, after my first marathon attempt that I did not succeed at, my best friend sent me her medal from the only marathon that she ran, because she felt like I deserved it more than she did, which I thought was like the nicest gesture.
Yeah, that's
and
awesome.
It's probably one of my favorite medals that I have now, even though it's from a race I never ran. But it's more the meaning behind it. Like and it came like 2 days after I got home. Like she immediately got on that, and that meant a lot.
Oh, that sounds like a great friend.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you must have been so happy when you got your medal from your real marathon.
Yes. It was nice. I'm not, again, as a not great athlete, I've never been one that's like motivated by trophies and like first place things. But that medal just symbolizes that you finished in a running race. And especially for one that carried so much meaning for me, I'd done half marathons in Chicago. The charity team that I run with is based in Chicago. So, like, the city alone and everything that went into it and just all the support that I got, it really felt like it was really impactful to have that medal moment, more so than any other race that I've had. And it was definitely super special. And I don't think I'll ever forget that.
Yeah, I mean, the only marathons I run are on Netflix, so.
That is honestly probably a better kind because 7.5 hours of straight running is not what I would say anyone would call like a fabulous time.
No, I mean, it sounds horrible, like, when you think of it, like, oh, you're gonna be walking or running for 7.5 hours, like.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I was worried running this marathon that people would assume that like I was cured or like my disability went away or just like things like that
I
because
mean,
normally like standing for an hour hurts my body too much, so I'll sit, or like I use a mobility scooter around my grad school campus or for long distances. So it's like I definitely had that fear where I thought people were going to see me running the marathon, even though I had all this assistance, and still be like, oh, well, why can't you go grocery shopping today? You ran a marathon last year.
there's a huge story right now with the BBC. I don't know if you read
Yeah,
about it. That like there's
good.
a lot of liars
Yeah.
and they're taking advantage. So I hope I don't have to like post that like, oh, Abby is a fraud and she got us all.
Yeah. So it's just one of those things where it's like no one thinks about that unless you're like in it. Because when I told someone that I was worried about that, they're like, why would you be worried about that? And I was like, well, because we're just trained that we see so many people that don't understand like dynamic disability or like changing disability, or that like that marathon was one snippet of time that took a lot of effort and energy and took like 12 people to make one person's like goal happen.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas like going grocery shopping is all just me. Like that's all me and my body and under my own like volition. So it's a little bit different. But people just don't understand that. So I was definitely worried that I was going to be putting out like a weird front if I like conquered this goal of mine. And then the next day was like not going grocery shopping by myself or whatever dumb thing, or like said, because for me, like sitting hurts a lot for my spine. So like I was worried that I would run a marathon, and then if I told someone I couldn't go to like this concert or this event because my back hurt and I didn't want to sit, that they'd be like, well, you ran a marathon, like shouldn't sitting be easy? So I was just so worried that the "but you ran a marathon" was going to be like everyone's reason to doubt everything that I did from then on out.
Yeah, I mean, if you could run a marathon, you can do like everything.
Yeah, well, that's what people think. I swear that's like a slogan of some marathons. Like, if you can run a marathon, you can do anything. Where it's like, I ran a marathon and I also cannot do a lot of things. So, but that sounds catchy. So,
It's a strange dynamic. I mean, that's the weird thing about chronic illnesses and diseases, that dynamic that can change from day to day.
yeah.
Like, it could even change from morning to night.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Like, if I do something in the morning that causes like a slight discomfort somewhere, and like that can crumble the whole rest of the day's plans as it like spirals into more pain or more just like feeling unwell. So,
Yeah. Well, so I'm assuming you know a bunch of more Ehlers-Danlos people, and I actually interviewed one before. I'm sure you know who she is. Her name's Emily Hall. I did a podcast
yeah.
episode with her, and we didn't really talk about Ehlers-Danlos that much. We talked about a bunch of other things, and it was a great episode. But it so you say you're on a spectrum of the collagens. Is this just similar to all the others, or does everyone have a different like baseline?
It's pretty, I guess like the whole umbrella itself of there's 13 subtypes of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. I believe is the right word. So the most common type is hypermobile EDS, and they're still trying to find a gene for that. Then for mine, which is classical, they have there's 3 genes associated with it, plus one unknown variant of a gene. And then there's vascular, and those affect different types of collagen, and all the different other subtypes all have genetic known things that they affect more than others. But everyone that experiences it differently. There's no straightforward, if you have hypermobile EDS, you're going to have this issue, and by the time you're 13, you're going to have this issue, and there's no timeline at all. And it really just seems to affect people so differently on this spectrum that I think that's where a lot of people run into issues getting diagnosed, because none of the issues are the same for everyone. For me, my spine is my biggest issue. It used to be my knees. Growing up, it was my knees, all day, every day. Then I had surgery, sort of took care of those. But then my spine became the biggest issue. And that's less common in EDS to have the same spine degeneration that I have. But it's still present in it, so they're not associating it with anything else.
So
other people.
So how do you get diagnosed? Then is it more an elimination of to matching your symptoms, or do you get a genetic test, or?
For me, we matched my symptoms, but then I was referred to a geneticist, luckily really early on. My pediatrician, I think, obviously I was too young to remember all the details, but I think he had just read about EDS, or his daughter had it, or some weird occurrence happened where once he saw that I had been to the ER twice with knee dislocations, and one was rolling over in bed, the other one I was coloring on the floor. Once he saw that those were really weird reasons for a kid to get injured, he immediately referred us to the geneticist, and she did genetic testing. But back then, which makes me sound old, I'm not old, but the genetic testing has come a long way since 2003. But back then we did a skin biopsy, and from there they looked at the collagen that was within your skin. And then they did some other genetic testing, and then that combined with the clinical picture is when they came up with the diagnosis of classical EDS, as opposed to the hypermobile type, which is more common but doesn't have the same genetic. That one's all clinical diagnosis. So then from there, that's just where we took it. But now that testing has come a lot further, we're actually looking into genetic testing again, I should say, because there are some unknown variants, and some of my symptoms don't quite match up with what I was originally diagnosed with in the EDS family of that gene pool. So since almost no one does a skin biopsy anymore, we're hoping we can get insurance to cover the blood test genetic testing that everyone else does now. Now you can just take a saliva sample and send it off, and they'll tell you what gene mutations you have.
That's so much easier.
Yeah. Back then it was I have this whole letter from the geneticist describing the whole skin biopsy microscope results, and I was I don't know what this means. And then I looked it up, and no one uses it anymore. So that's where I feel old, when I say that I was diagnosed by skin biopsy, and everyone's who does that? I was apparently we did it in 2003.
Yeah,
but we've definitely learned a lot more since then.
But what? So you're saying you want to get retested? What will it help you in any way, or is it more of a confirmation, I guess, comfort for you?
I think part of it is confirmation, because I brought it up with a different doctor that I saw, and she was no matter what, even if the genetic test comes back with weird results, she's your clinical diagnosis would never change. She's you fit these symptoms way too closely, and fit all the testing criteria to ever have that diagnosis ever change. You would just be the same diagnosis, but a different gene variant. But I guess in the future for family planning and things like that is when insurance likes to cover that type of thing because it would change the inheritance pattern. But I don't really plan on having birth children, so I don't think that's a problem. But I think at this point, I just want more of that confirmation for some of the different like spine and neurological symptoms that I've had that don't really line up anyway.
So you get diagnosed, then what?
When I got diagnosed, they sent us home with a brochure. Um, and I believe that was it. Like I was too young to like remember a lot of it. I know I got orthotics made shortly after. And back then it was more like, and it still is now, like all you can do is manage symptoms. So you're kind of always playing that like losing game because you can only treat a symptom after you've already experienced it. But they started with like orthotics that I hated as a kid. I remember getting those made right away. And then I think we just had like a looser plan in place for like if I had a dislocation, like wasn't allowed to like go to recess or gym class for like a week after. Because there's no like sports to take you out of as a kid, but the physical activity that you do as a kid is recess and gym class. So those two were like more of a plan. Having a diagnosis helped because some of the injuries that kids can present with can mimic child abuse because they're weird injuries.
Okay.
Like if I say as a kid, if I was like, I dislocated my knee and I was just getting out of bed, like that sounds like the classic, I fell down the stairs or like I ran into a cabinet thing that you would hear. Yeah, so some of those, so having that diagnosis in my chart as a kid was helpful, especially as someone that showed up with weird dislocations, but then it also, EDS causes like really easy bruising just because of the skin fragility. So kids bruise all the time because they're rough and tumbling. But then when you have like even more than the usual and you're showing up with a weird dislocation, which most kids don't have dislocations, then like that can lead to some suspicious circumstances if you don't have that diagnosis on it. And not everyone with EDS has issues in childhood like that. Like some kids might just have like pain and instability in childhood that doesn't become dislocations until later either. So it's kind of a mixed bag.
I mean, that makes total sense. So there's nothing you can do to help the actual condition. Are there any preventative measures you can take to prevent injuries?
So I guess the most thing I would do to prevent injuries is like first it's always the strengthening, which usually happens first in physical therapy, and then you move on to like doing it on your own. Sometimes like bracing, like using a brace on your joint, like a knee brace or whatever, can help stabilize a joint that isn't strong enough yet to like hold itself together. Sometimes bracing is controversial in the EDS world for medical professionals, not for patients. I think patients are great with it. But because it can cause a little bit like your muscles to not have to work as hard. So it can cause muscle weakening if you rely on the brace solely forever. So like that's not always a long-term solution, but it's always great for like any like immediate dislocation care, or just like if you don't feel stable, or if you're going out somewhere. Like if I was going somewhere that I really knew like a knee dislocation would not be great, I would probably consider like wearing a knee brace, or you can use like kinesiology tape or any type of like rock tape to hold your joints a little bit more stable and give some of that connection. And that's really like the main thing. That and pain control are the two biggest things that you can do to hopefully prevent something from happening. But a lot of it is reactive care, because I could spend all day long like taking care of my muscles, strengthening them, and doing whatever I need to like feel better, and I could still end up like dislocating my shoulder the next day. So it's kind of that fine balance between caring for them, using like the correct bracing when you need it, and then sort of just treating that pain once it's there or before it's there, if you have that in your plan.
So, like, how often do you dislocate something then?
For me, I don't dislocate as often as a lot of people. Especially growing up, like my dislocations were always more major. I've always heard with my other friends that have EDS, a lot of them have a partial dislocation or what's called a subluxation, which is just where it like slides out, slides back in by itself. A lot of people had more of those as opposed to like dislocations that take you to the ER. So that's where I was a little bit different. But then I'd say like something shifts in my body at least like 3 to 4 times a week, which is like fairly low for some people. But sometimes like I don't fully know if something's like not in the right place. Like if my shoulder's slightly out of place, I don't know it until I like somehow put it back in place. And then I'm like, oh, that's why that was kind of sore today. Like didn't realize it. So there's a lot of things like that, but more major ones, I don't know the last time I've had one that was big enough to require like medical. Well, I guess I dislocated my shoulder in class last year. Last year, 2 years ago. Right before the pandemic, like seriously, like the week before the world shut down. I was in a class and I dislocated my shoulder and I put it back in without anybody noticing. But then later that day, my shoulder felt like it was on fire. So then I had to figure out care, and then the world shut down, and then we just ignored it. And now it's a chronic issue. But that was probably my last like major one. But I know a lot of people have them a lot more often than I do.
I mean, it's totally badass to pop your shoulder in class.
I mean, it was one of those things where I just panicked. Like I was leaning on my desk, like I had like my shoulder, like my hands on my desk, and somehow just like the weight of me leaning into the shoulder and then the shoulder being rotated was just like too much for it. And all of a sudden I like felt like I fell into my desk because all of a sudden my shoulder wasn't holding me up, and then I just like reacted and like quickly like shoved my shoulder without even thinking, and then I like heard the click and I was like, oh, that was good. Let me just continue taking notes here and hope that nobody looks at me.
I mean, that's totally badass. Like, I'd be freaking out.
I mean, it's one of those things that I've always hated. Like, it's always my biggest fear that I will get an injury in public in front of strangers, like with no one around that I know. That's been my fear since childhood. I think since my first dislocation occurred when I was little and I was home alone. Not home alone. We were having a garage sale and I was the only one in the house. So like I was like 6. I wasn't home alone, but I was in the house alone when it happened. So I was like crying for help for a very long time before like a neighbor walked into our house to like get water or something. So I think from then on out, when it was like a random neighbor that came to find me the first time that it happened, it's always been a fear of mine that something will happen in like a room full of strangers and I will not know what to do.
I mean,
or like how to direct them.
I mean, well, for one, I assume you're just still like mentally there so you can guide people. But like,
Yeah.
what should people know what to do?
I think that's a hard one because most of the time I can get a joint back into place because for me it's just been like my shoulders and my knees and occasionally my fingers, but those are really easy to put back in. But if it's like a bigger one, like especially if it was my knees back when they dislocated like completely and like we went to the ER, the biggest thing was more listening, but also like taking control of the situation too. Whereas like, I mean, obviously when it fully dislocates, it hurts like heck and it stays out. And the longer it's out, the longer your body freaks out. And I know when I was younger and even like as I got to like 10 and 12 and 13, I really just wanted someone else to make the decisions. Like I didn't want them to ask me any questions. I really just wanted someone to be like, all right, we're going to the ER or we're like calling someone. So at least for me personally, if I'm ever in a situation like that, most friends that I'm with, if I'm with a friend, I carry most of my medical information on me. But if it were to happen, I would personally direct someone to just call someone for help and then go from there. I don't know that I would try to like have a stranger drive me somewhere or what, but I think like listening to the person is good, but also like listening when they say that like they just want someone else to make the decisions is like equally valid.
So are you afraid to be alone, or do you always have like someone near you to like that knows you but also knows your condition to help, just to have that second person?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm afraid to be alone. I lived alone during when I was at grad school for a year and a half, sort of pandemic time. I was back home, but there was definitely a lot of fear going into living alone for the first time. Not even talking about like managing living alone. Like that alone was like terrifying, but more just the thought of like, what if I get injured and my phone isn't near me? Or like I got no, like literally no one was gonna show up. Like there wasn't like a roommate that would eventually come home or anything like that. So it definitely took a little bit of getting over that fear, I think, and sort of thinking of plans and doing my best to always carry my phone very close to me. But that was definitely like a big fear where I was like, well, what if, because for me, like my back can like seize up like a couple times a year where like I can barely move. And I was like, what if that happens and I'm like on the kitchen floor and the phone is like on the counter? I was like, I don't know what to do.
Do you by any chance have an Apple Watch?
I do, and I got one recently, but I really meant to get one when I lived alone.
Yeah, because that would be perfect. You can just talk to it.
Yeah, so that's now that I have that, I feel really good too. And I meant to get something in place when I lived at my apartment by myself. And now that I'm back home, it's less important, but I still find myself bringing my phone like everywhere I go. Like I don't even like leaving it. Like, you know, you're told to like leave it up or leave it in a different room or whatever at nighttime, or like some people can like walk away from their phone. But I've noticed that it's like an inherent habit of mine just to have it on me. And honestly, more from like the safety standpoint than like me needing the phone. But like
you need life alert.
Yeah. I wish they came in cooler options. I looked into that before I moved because I was like, because I worked at a gym when I was there and we worked alone. Like we were the only staff member at the gym. And like we opened and closed it too. So there was like a good half an hour I was alone in this giant gym building. And I was like, what if I got injured there? I was like, do I have to wait for someone to like get in the door and come find me? But all the life alert options were either really expensive or they just looked funny.
Well, I know Apple Watch has an option where if you fall and I think if you don't answer, it automatically calls 911.
Oh, that's a good feature. I don't know if I have that turned on.
It's off. I'm pretty sure it's off by default by your age.
Yeah.
But I think if you're older than 65, it's on automatically, and it'll like call. It might be an option that I think can call, or I don't know if it automatically calls 911 first, or if it calls the family members and 911 or something, but it alerts people to know that you've fallen. And you can,
that's good to know.
yeah, and then, well, it's like if you fall and it gives you like a warning, like if you don't answer your watch in like, I don't know, like 30 seconds or something, then it'll call.
Oh, God, yeah. See, that would be really helpful because that would have like, so that was honestly, like I spent a long time like researching ways to like feel safer living alone.
I think the feature came out like 2 years ago. So that's like
Well, that's good to know. Yeah, I didn't have an Apple Watch then, but then the pandemic hit and I ended up not living at home or at my apartment for as long as I normally would have. I think I would have gotten an Apple Watch in that time frame, but I was there for like 6 months, then I was home for 8 months, and then I was there for 4 months.
I mean, it's also cool to like, you can like talk with it, like talking to someone. So it's really cool.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's cool to talk to someone without like your phone, like if you're just doing dishes or something.
Yeah, that is nice.
So.
Yeah, so that I mean that's definitely I think something. I don't think I'm afraid to like I don't feel bad like going to like stores and on errands by myself, but it's definitely like in the back of my head, and I think it's just trained from childhood where like I was embarrassed. I was a shy kid. It's like the worst thing that could happen to a shy kid was to have to like scream in public. So I think I'm like holding on to some of that like childhood fear as an adult, whereas now I would recognize probably that if I'm in pain, I don't really care what I look like or what people think of me. I would just like someone to help, and that's it.
Except if it's like around your crush or something, then that's
Yeah, well then there's a whole new problem because then I'll end up like toughing it out and be like, I'm fine, as like my arms hanging limp to the side.
I mean, you must have pretty cool party tricks.
We definitely do, or I do. I know some of the things that people can do. I'm like less flexible than I think a lot of people are with EDS. But some of the like the traditional party tricks that people can do end up causing like more joint damage, so they're recommended to like not do them. But I know some people still do them, or like my fingers are really hypermobile. More so than I think a lot of people's that I've noticed. But I don't notice anything.
You'll do anything to impress your crust, am I right?
Yeah, you know, but at the same time, it's like some people think it's gross. Like I had a kid deny a high five when I was a kid because he thought my hands were gross. Which, as like a child, that's devastating when you go up for like a high five and the person's like, "Ew." Like, what do you like? What kid is gonna be like, "Oh, that's fine. I don't need him." Like, you're gonna feel bad about it no matter what, even if you know they don't mean it or no one else said anything. But generally, the reaction to my fingers when someone notices it is like a ew reaction, which is always super lovely. So whenever like kids notice it or kids like ask to see it, I always preface with, "Okay, but you cannot make fun of me and you cannot say ew." And like once I establish those rules, then kids are more like fascinated by it, as opposed to like grossed out the second I tell them that they're not allowed to be grossed out. But I did have a situation when I was in grad school where I was meeting with someone that I worked with, like one of my bosses, and she saw that like I don't even know what I was doing, but I was like stretching. I don't even know what I was doing, to be honest. Something, she saw that my like shoulder had more range of motion than a regular person. And she said something like, "Oh my God, that's so gross, I'm gonna puke." And I was like, I remember like being shocked in the moment where I was like, did you just say that I like something that I like that my body does is so gross that you can't stand it? I was like, I don't think that's appropriate. But I was like brand new, so I didn't say anything. But I think I wrote about it on Instagram like later that day, where I was like, I hate that that's so many people's reactions to like people that are more flexible or that just have different ranges of motion, that like our first instinct is to like say that it's super gross when it's technically you're telling the person that their body is gross.
Yeah, it's a little extreme.
Yeah, so but it's almost everyone, and I think it dates back to like, we could get real in depth into the history of it, but like the circus freak era, a lot of those people, like the contortionists, likely had EDS.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
Because there are quite a few people. I am not as flexible as some people with EDS, but I know the hypermobile subtype. Some people are quite flexible.
I never thought about that.
Yeah, so I think we sort of like still, it's like our gut reaction to think that anything different is gross. But I don't know what it is about like hypermobility that so many like strangers find it okay to like voice that grossness. Like, I don't know, like who else would be like, ew, your shoulder, like to like a stranger? But someone will say to them like, "Oh my God, your finger bends backwards. That's so gross." And I was like, I'm just trying to like read a book here. Like, what do you want from me? So it's definitely, it's interesting how that sort of plays out. But I think with a dislocation, nobody would realize that it was like a weird situation in public. So they would just think it was like an injury and not like someone's body just being different.
I mean, I guess if the situation arises, I'd be more freaked out, and like I don't know if I just call like 911, or it's like, does she know? Like, is she okay?
Yeah, I think if it was like a major dislocation where somebody needed help, like you would know. because you would like see the joint that would look out of place, and like the person would probably not be super quiet. It's usually the ones that can like go back into place right away that you might not notice, like in a room with someone. Um, but if it's like out, especially like with if you think of like a kneecap, like you know where a kneecap's supposed to be. So if you imagine that it's all of a sudden somewhere that it's not supposed to be, that's usually like a red flag. That's one.
Yeah, I mean, you have to agree that it is kind of gross, though.
Oh, I 100% agree. I cannot watch videos of knee dislocations. I don't know, like some other injury videos, like maybe I can handle, but something about just like the empathetic response in me to like see any type of like dislocation video, like it like makes me cringe inside.
Yeah, it's like that's not normal at all. Like,
yeah, because like I can see the injury happen, but then I also know what it feels like. So then like that fun memory gets to be played at the same time, where other people are just like, oh, that looks really uncomfortable and gross. Whereas I'm like, that looks gross and I know what it feels like. So we're just gonna replay that memory. So that's one injury video that I like cannot watch. That's game over for me.
yeah, I did want to say that me and Abby were in a rare community, and I meet like once a month. And every time I see you, I always think of like Austin Powers with your white chair. And I always feel like you have like a button or something, and then like your walls open up and there's like a shark tank behind you with like lasers.
Oh man, I so wish that was true.
Yeah, you have like you're just like sitting in like a lair.
I love that. I have never thought of it, but I did notice.
Well, the white chair gives you have like that futuristic white chair.
Yeah,
Like
it really does.
Like you do like a slow rotation.
Oh,
And like an evil laugh or something.
I really feel like I need to up this room into a lab. Gonna have to do some remodeling. I think you've given some inspiration there.
Yeah, you did need like a green screen. That helps.
Oh, there we go.
This is cheaper route.
All right. Well, maybe in the next meetup, I will show up with a Shark Tank virtual background.
Yeah. And,
no one else will get it, but we will.
I think they will with the chair. The chair helped a lot with the image.
But would the virtual background take away the chair?
No, if you put the green screen behind the chair, no.
Oh.
Yeah, they can do the.
Keep it.
Like you know when they ask what question, like who you are and stuff, you can do like a slow rotation.
Oh my gosh, I don't know if I could pull off that character work for so long. Acting is not my specialty.
Oh, you should have taken those acting classes when you mentioned it earlier.
I should have, when that doctor was like, you can try theater, as if like that was the solution to not playing sports. I don't know. Maybe I should have. I would have had some skills.
Yeah. So before I take the mic away from you, is there anything you'd like to add, or promote, or pitch in, or anything?
I don't think so. I guess the main thing is like anyone, especially listening, but movement is a special like interest and skill of mine that I really love promoting in anyone with any ability. But I found that like adaptive sports are definitely like a way that we can still engage in sport or leisure activities without it being swimming or golf. We don't have to be limited to like what an activity someone says. There's a lot of times there's ways to modify almost anything we do. So I think movement can be a hot topic in the EDS community, especially if you're someone coming off of an acute injury. It can feel impossible to move again or to do sports or anything like that. But I've definitely found that changing the way that we move and finding things that you enjoy is worth it. And I think that's something that I'm hoping to continue promoting going forward from here and whatever else I do in advocacy. But that's like a little special advocacy interest, is just connecting people with sports that they like and then finding ways to adapt it without having to give up the sport completely in general. So that's probably the only other thing that I have to say.
Okay, well, this is Abby. I'll put all her social media links below. You can click on it. Thank you so much for coming here, and thank you for everyone for listening, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.
See ya.